India's booming textile trade in the 17th and 18th centuries had major consequences on traditional textile practices. The highly coveted textiles that traveled the world contributed significantly to the colonization of India under the Dutch and later the British East India Company. In India, the period of colonial power saw a number of changes in the independence of weaver communities, economic regulations surrounding textile trade, as well as in handloom traditions themselves. The prosperous textile trade influenced migration patterns and the practices of artisanal groups within India. These communities were moved to urban centers where they lived in black towns, which were crowded ghettos with cramped spaces and poor sanitation facilities set up by the British administration. Here, they worked to produce textiles predominantly catering to European markets. We see these areas prominently in this map of Fort St. George in Madras that gives us a glimpse of how the city was planned. As you can see, the area marked as Black Town is densely packed with minimal spaces between housing blocks. These living quarters stood in stark contrast to the adjacent White Town, where the European population lived along with upper-class Indians. White towns, which you see here, typically featured stately buildings and spacious boulevards, compared to the tiny by-lanes and crowded markets occupied by the native workers and artisans. Not only did textile workers live in detrimental conditions, but their work was restricted to predetermined patterns and designs, limiting their scope and creative freedom. In addition to the restrictive living and working conditions, artisans also began to face intense competition from machine-made textiles that started to be produced in Britain as a result of the Industrial Revolution. This period severely impacted India's textile trade, transforming the country from being a supplier of finished textiles to one that exported raw materials used to make them. It began in the 18th century when textile manufacturers set up mills in many parts of Britain. A majority of these were located in Manchester, the world's first center of mass production, nicknamed Cottonopolis. At first, the raw cotton for mill-made fabrics was sourced from the southern states of the United States of America. American cotton was a labor-intensive crop, primarily grown in plantations by enslaved people who were brought from Africa. This changed after the outbreak of the American Civil War, which stifled trade, resulting in British manufacturers relying more on India for the supply of raw materials. While India had historically produced some of the world's finest cotton, the scale of this production grew exponentially after the increased demand from Britain. Raw cotton from all parts of the country began to be transported to port cities like Bombay, where it was pressed and packed in large warehouses and marketplaces to be prepared for export. The entire landscape of the Indian economy was impacted. Not only was cotton sold for extremely cheap prices, but finished textiles made by weavers were also heavily taxed for export to the British mainland. As a result, India lost its global markets for handspun and handwoven textiles. As the global demand for handmade Indian textiles fell, and colonial rule leached Indian kingdoms of the funds to support regional traditions, the market for artisanal goods shrunk considerably. Furthermore, Indian consumers began to buy mill-made cloth imported from Britain. These circumstances affected many handmade traditions such as brocades, Telia rumals, and himru, to name a few. In fact, the negative impact of Britain's mill-made textiles resonated so deeply for traditions like the fine Dhaka muslin that they were lost forever. The mass-produced, machine-made fabrics that replaced them have never been able to replicate their softness and fine quality. The decline of India's handloom industry had long-lasting repercussions in India. Not only was it detrimental to the nation's economy, but it also disrupted coveted textile traditions. It's only because of a number of revival efforts made when the country gained independence from colonial rule that our knowledge of certain traditions, from the Chamba Rumals of Himachal Pradesh to the Ikkats of Pochampally, are alive today.